Hello and welcome to this very, very special live event celebrating Revels' 50th anniversary, with several different elements to this gathering that we have here at St. John's on Mount Auburn Street in Watertown, the headquarters of Revels, of course, and we're in a hall here where Revels often rehearses, with the doors and the windows open and our social distancing very carefully measured out. We're feeling very, very comfortable here together with three very special people that you're going to meet in just a moment, associated with Revels for many, many years. We're celebrating and we'll be talking about this CD, which is quite extraordinary, the Christmas Revels celebrating 50 years, a whole treasure trove of recordings made throughout that period, and quite extraordinary in its scope, extracting lots of songs and information and poetry even from around the world. So looking forward to talking about that and talking about upcoming online performances of Revels, which of course is a reality this year, as Revels will move virtual during this 50th anniversary. And we're looking forward to a conversation and hearing from some of the performers over the last multiple of years, over the decades in fact. So I'm Brian O'Donovan from WGBH, and of course a longtime fan of Revels. I can not remember one that I have missed over the last 20 years or so. So I'm delighted to be here in person with, and I'm going to introduce them, of course, to any of you who are watching now. You will recognize essentially the face and the voice of Revels. He has been with the organization for many, many years. We'll talk about exactly how long and his arrival on stage at Sanders Theatre. That is, of course, David Coffin.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for doing this for us.
Great to have you with us. Next to David, we have the longtime music director of Revels and so much involved in the emergence of Revels as such a powerful force over the last multiple of decades. Again, we're talking about George Emlin, who was very much involved in directing the 50th CD, selecting the pieces and making sure that the packaging was all in order. And in the next position and the final position of our trio here, we have the longtime artistic director, and again, of course, a mover and shaker in the development of Revels for so many years, and that's Paddy Swanson. Great to have you with us, Paddy.
Hi, Brian. Thank you.
All three of you, though. It's really wonderful to be gathered here and where it all happens. I myself was here a number of years ago when I got a chance to perform with Revels and experience the very special nature of this room and really what Revels has done over those years. George, starting with you, though, 50 years contained in this boxed set here. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about that?
Well, you can't imagine what it's like to dive into Revels history and to dig out some of these gems. There's more there than anybody can imagine or remember, certainly. And the three of us have been around for a long time, and I'm sure that these guys will be surprised, even they will be surprised to hear some of this stuff on this CD. It's a real treasure trove, as you say. And it's been a great experience for me to be able to do the deep dive and figure out where some of these gems are and to bring them to life. All of these cuts, all of these tracks have never been recorded by Revels before. So they're all new, with the exception of one, which should tell you something, because we've put out more than 30 CDs over the years, and so to have another CD which doesn't have anything which has been previously recorded tells you something about the depth of our material.
And the longevity of the organization as well. Paddy, to you though, the provenance of Revels generally comes from New York. I think we can trace it back to New York, right? And a very special person growing up in New York in the area called Brooklyn Heights.
Depends, how far back you want to go, really. I think, it started off in the living room in Brooklyn Heights, where Jack Langstaff was brought up by his parents, and they always had these Christmas parties. And I think he loved singing carols. He got into that idea of somebody saying, okay, we're going to do Good King Wenceslas, you be the king, you be the boy. So it's like instant theater in your living room, and I think that grabbed him. And he went on, of course, to be a famous baritone with his own career, and eventually ended up at Sanders Theatre, throwing it all on the stage, everything that he loved.
We'll get a chance to talk about Jack again and his family. Of course, his daughter Carol very much involved in the origins.
She was instrumental in inviting him up here to redo an earlier version of Revels that he did at Town Hall in the 50s.
Well, we could have a program dedicated just to Jack's life in the early days and his commitment to rituals and establishing something that would outlive him. And of course, it has, much to his delight, I'm positive. David, you have become really the voice and the face of Revels for many years. Jack was the initial voice and face. He retired, I think, back in the mid-1990s, but you had already established a history with Revels. Tell us about your arrival with this unique institution.
I showed up in 1980 was my first show, and that was all due to hearing a tune called the Abbot's Bromley, which was played on the recorder by Liesl Kuhlbach, who we're going to hear from a little bit later. And my stepmother played that record, the very first Revels record for me. It was an actual record. And I fell in love with the tune. And being a recorder player, I just felt compelled to need to play that tune somewhere. And where else could you play that tune but on the Revels stage? So I contacted Jack. And the rest is history.
And the rest is great history as well. But back to the Abbot's Bromley for a second, because I don't want to leave it, because it is a marker as well, almost like Lord of the Dance. The Abbot's Bromley is there, this mesmeric kind of round and round, and so suited to the recorder, essentially. That's what it's played at.
Well, that's what Revels plays it on, yes. In Cambridge we do. And in some of the other cities they use other instruments, but Here in Cambridge, we will only play it on the recorder, at least if I have anything to say about it.
George, the pure scope of Revels over those years, just the extent to which you've traveled around the world looking for material, celebrating cultures, that has been a deep sense of what Revels' value proposition is all about.
Yes, and that's the other thing about the CD is that it's so eclectic. We just jump from one culture to another as a way of illustrating, dramatizing how many cultures we've covered over those 40, 50 years. And to juxtapose some of those cultures back to back just brings that into highlight sometimes.
Really, really thrilling. I can imagine that that's the case. Paddy, we have Jack Langstaff with his daughter Carol starting this ritual on stage. When is it? We're talking about the late 50s, is that correct? The very first?
Well, no, the 50s was an earlier version, a sort of Elizabethan masque is how they tended to describe it. Meaning that the audience and very importantly, the audience and the people on the stage were intermixed in a way that was originally something that you could attribute to the Elizabethan masque.
And that was of key importance to the Langstaffs.
Yeah,
Jack
hugely
and Carol.
important. And the audience has always been a major factor all the way through, and still is. And they're great audiences, Jack would say, he said he could ask them to do anything, and they would do it. And at odd moments you can hear him sometimes in these clips saying, "Sing!" and they did.
In that baritone voice of his, I think you would stand to attention and sing.
That's right. You just do it. Even if you don't have a voice at all, it just comes out.
As we're having this conversation, the doors and the windows are open in St. John's here on Mount Auburn Street, the headquarters of Revels, so you may hear some extraneous sound, but we're in real time here, as Revels is in real time in all of its productions. Now, jumping ahead from those very early masques, as you call them, tell us how this got to Cambridge.
Well, I think, Jack lost his shirt, I think, on the show that he did at Town Hall. NBC, I think, invited him to make a Christmas special of it later, in which Dustin Hoffman played the dragon.
Whoa, really?
He was The Graduate hadn't come out yet, but so he was still a struggling actor. But then Carol was up here as a folk singer, I think, in the 60s. And in 1971, she asked Jack to come up and try it out again. And they were given Sanders Theatre by Archie Epps, who was the dean at the time and responsible. And I think he got it for nothing. I don't know. I never saw a contract for that. But and the first show, I think, was done for $2 or $3 a head, and people just loved it.
Probably a single show.
I think two shows on one day.
So it was already becoming popular. It was already had some resonance.
Right, and then they added another show, to 3 shows, and the prices went up.
I can imagine they did. And turning to you, David Coffin, again, how important is Sanders Theatre and the identification, the experience that is Revels?
Sanders Theatre is the most intimate theater that I've ever been in. You can fit, I think, just a little over 1,100 people, and it was built as a lecture hall. So it was designed for one person to stand on that stage and talk without amplification to, a full house, so to speak. Obviously, students, but in terms of intimacy, which is really what Revels is all about, is drawing the audience in. There's nowhere in that theater where you don't feel like you're part of what's happening on stage, and that's the beauty of Sanders. Let alone it's a beautiful place to be.
It really, really is. And many of the recordings on this CD, on the CD celebrating 50 years, recorded live, George, at Sanders Theatre. So that must also come into the recordings, not just the visual or the atmospheric, but the actual audio quality of Sanders as well is quite special.
Yeah. And we've worked very closely with Bill Wynn, audio engineer, over the year, and he is largely responsible for evening out the sound quality between 1977 and 2017, 40 years of difference in there, making them sound as though they all more or less belong in the same CD. But having said that, you'd have to admit there is a lot of difference in sound. The audio technology has changed a lot. The audiences are essentially the same. The hall is exactly the same, although that's been worked on over the years to modify the acoustics slightly. But you feel right from the very first track, the first Noel, 1977, you can hear that audience out there just roaring away. And the same thing in 2020. You can just hear that same full-bodied sound coming from the audience, which is so gratifying. And it's kind of one of the characteristics of the CD is that you're aware of the audience all the time. And the performances are not flawless. They are live performance, live theater, because in fact this is theater. And so you're going to hear a lot of scuffling and coughing and people doing their thing on stage, and it's really beautiful to hear.
It is beautiful to hear, and I can absolutely attest to that. As you said, it's not flawless, but neither is life itself flawless, and that's something that you've celebrated over the years, Paddy. And bringing this is, in many ways, professional presentations, but community, repertory, everything blended in. So much so, in fact, that it's hard to categorize. And I understand that the National Endowment for the Arts actually said at one stage that Revels needed its own category.
Yeah, they puzzled about it as much as us. A lot of people try and define themselves with an elevator pitch, and ours would have to go to the 202nd floor, I think. That's part of its identity, I think, that it is those things. But bringing amateurs and professionals together are part of that alchemy. That the one has a passion and an immediacy of energy, and the other has a technique, and you can bring those together. The passion will stir the souls of the professionals who become jaded, and the technique is obvious to the people who are watching how it's done. And the idea is that George and I would bring those two things together until they are in a place that is a little different from most performances.
What comes true in everybody that I know sitting in the seats in Revels, and anybody that I talk to outside of the Christmas period, talk about talks about the warmth of the theatre and the warmth of being in the comfort of each other, which is a large part of what makes Revels so special. In addition to what's going on the stage, what's going on right and left of you and behind you is as important in the overall impact. But it is a very, very special recording to be celebrating, George, and you must feel very proud of all of the material that has come together here.
Yeah, I'm very, very pleased with the way it all turned out, because I think it does represent, as well as you can represent Revels at all in an audio recording, which is a challenge in itself, because Revels is such a multifaceted, multimedia event. It does represent Revels in all of its breadth and depth, and a lot of material in there from children. There's even dance and an instrumental material, which is an essential part. The audience participation is very evident. That's an essential part. And lots of guest soloists, chorus, women's chorus alone, men's chorus alone. Every combination, every permutation that we try to put on stage, I've tried to reflect in the CD.
We're going to go into some postcards in just a little while, and we're going to listen to some folks who have performed in Revels over the years, over quite a span. But there are traditions associated with Revels within the performance of Christmas Revels that are extraordinarily important. Songs like Lord of the Dance, for example. Talk about the importance of those rituals, something that people can come back to year after year, almost like a touchstone. Or is it a reassurance for people that things are okay?
That's a good word for it. I think reassurance is an excellent way to put it, because Revels has always been a balance between the unfamiliar and the familiar. And it's always sometimes a tricky, that's one of the balances that we try to create. There are many. And it's so comforting to come back to Lord of the Dance, and people who have, if they remember only one thing about Revels, they remember that just before the intermission, everybody leapt out of their seats and streamed out of the theater into the hall, joining hands and singing this refrain, "Dance then wherever you may be." And, for 20 times, until it got so crowded out in the hall that David puts a stop to it. It is a very important moment to come back to every year, and it's true for 2 or 3 other moments, and especially the very closing song, which is the Sussex Mummers' Carol. People come to treasure that as an iconic moment and something that they would not tolerate us dropping out of the program.
Well, I'm going to ask David Coffin about the one year possibly that you made a huge faux pas and a huge error in actually dropping that. But just before I get to David on that anecdote, I remember myself going to my very first Revels. I came here in 1980, but didn't get to Revels probably until the late 80s. And I remember being viscerally so moved because I was surprised by that Lord of the Dance. And it was suddenly I was being wafted out doing something that I hadn't expected to be doing, holding hands with perfect strangers. And especially in the context of what we're talking about here today, or in the context, the backdrop of COVID, how wonderful is that human contact, and how important is it going to be after COVID is by us, and COVID will be by us, and we'll be back doing that. That will be an indication to me that the world is back to normal, is the day that I can get into the hallway of Sanders Theatre and hold people's hands.
And I love that you used the word surprise. You were surprised the first time that happened, and
surprised
you were
by
swept up in the movement.
Absolutely.
And I think so. It is familiar to people who've seen it before, but it's a total shocker for people who've never seen it before.
Absolutely, and I've been there with shy people as well who've been taken out of their shell pretty quickly and didn't expect it.
One of my favorite parts of doing Lord of the Dance is after the last verse, I go out into the back of the house and grab carefully an audience member and bring them and hopefully everyone behind them out into the hall. But I always look for the person who's got that deer in the headlights expression on their face, because I know they have no idea what's going on. Usually I can find that person who's never been, and that's the hand I go for, whether it's being offered to me or not.
Yeah,
And it's an enormous amount of
you
fun.
can define Revels as the geometric opposite of social distancing.
That is a very good way to put it, and long may it be so. And those of you who know David Coffin and have been confronted with him coming off that stage will know that you are not going to refuse that hand to follow him out into the hallway. Dona Nobis Pacem, something you teach from the stage, which is a very, very quiet moment, a very beautiful moment, a very kind of, it brings salve and balm to the wounded heart, if you will. That song everybody expects. The Sussex Mummers Carol George had referred to at the end. There's a recording of it on the 50th, of course, there is. And what is the impact of that, and what would happen if you didn't do it?
Well, I mention the story sometimes when I do the teaching at the beginning of the show, when we run through the songs that the audience will join us. Is the Sussex Mummers Carol ends every Revels program in throughout the country. Every city does the Sussex Mummers Carol at the end, and it's kind of odd to think about it, but in 1977, I believe it was, they decided not to use the Sussex Mummers Carol in the show. I say they because I wasn't there yet. I'm not even sure I was born yet. But in any case, it wasn't in the show, and at the end of the show, the audience stood up and sang it anyway. And when you think about it, that was 1977, and the first Revels in Cambridge was only 1971. So in just that time frame, it had become an expected staple of the show, and they were not having it. Right. They were not going to have it.
And there was ownership on the part of the audience already, Paddy.
That's right. Yeah,
and I think it wasn't Jack's show anymore. It was the audience's show.
That's the mark of a ritual, I think. When things become ritualized, they're taken out of your hands, basically. I mean, it becomes a thing of itself. That's something, that Revels maybe didn't work into the blueprint, but the fact that the Revels experience itself became a tradition. And then people kind of sewed that into their family expectation. People, would meet up coming from the north and the south, and they'd meet in Boston and have a meal and go to the show. And it then becomes part of their own personal ritual. And that's very powerful.
It is very, very powerful indeed.
I think the same thing happens with your show, with the Celtic Christmas.
It has, and of course a lot of that modelling came from my influence from Jack Langstaff himself, and my meeting him and really appreciating what he was doing and taking that to a little narrower, because it's mostly Irish and Scottish with a smattering of other Celtic activity. But that idea of coming together, especially at the darkest time of the year, is an old tradition, George, and Revels welcomes in those traditions that are Christian or pre-Christian. They seem to blend seamlessly together quite well, musically, dance-wise, and particularly ritual-wise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We sometimes get criticized for being too Christian, and sometimes get criticized for being too pagan, and we're both. The Christian element is certainly there. It's in our title. It's in the Lord of the Dance, but it really transcends any particular religion in its iconography and its treatment, especially as we've been talking about, because it's a ritual, a very powerful ritual that gets people to join hands. I'm specifically talking about Lord of the Dance here. That it really is not just about, if you listen to the words, fine, but if you actually go wider and high and deeper than that, you're in an experience, a ritual experience, which transcends any religious impulse.
The Christmas Revels celebrating 50 years. This is the CD. It's an absolute beauty, a double CD, and it also has an extraordinary article written by Scott Alaric, which I want to talk about in just a moment. But of course, in buying the CD, not alone will you get a keepsake of 50 years of Revels, really, really well curated and put together on the CD set, but you will also be supporting Revels, because Revels, after all, is a not-for-profit organization. It is in a very, very real way. I know from talking with these folks and being around the organization, they feel that they're keepers of a public trust, and that this will outlast any individual because it's belonged to the community. It's belonged to the audience. Before we go to our first video and our first postcard, George, talk about Scott Alaric. You asked Scott Alaric, the great writer for the Globe and for so many novelists, and has written such wonderful books as Deep Community about the folk community in Massachusetts. But he wrote a beautiful, almost a definitive account of the history of Revels.
That's a good word for it, because in I was going to say a few pages, but it does go on. It's a considerable essay.
Really,
but he manages to cover all the bases, and he talks to he quotes a lot of people who go way back, and he quotes them accurately. He's a really, really fine journalist, as we know from his years on the Globe, and he's always had a passion for Revels. So he's going at this with his, with his passion and his tools as a journalist, and it's really comprehensive, and it's really terrific reading.
And Scott is a passionate advocate for community as well. So I think that's a real driving force, and certainly informs his passion for Revels as that institution. So, Paddy, we're going to you, because the first singer that we have coming up, somebody who was very important in the early days of Revels, is a countryman of yours. First of all, where were you born?
Well, actually, I was born in Massachusetts, in Brockton.
How disappointing. What did you do?
I know.
You got that accent through a correspondence course, I bet you.
Well, I was a war baby. So, my mother was a displaced person.
Seriously?
She came over to see the 1939 World's Fair, because it was the wonder of the world.
In New York, right?
Yeah, and a few weeks later, war broke out. She couldn't get back. And so she met my father here. I was born. My father was killed, and we went back to England in 1945. So from then on, I was brought up in Manchester. So, my cultural roots are definitely English.
And it fits in really with a lot of Revels as well. A lot of the medieval Revels, the early Revels rituals coming from England, from Western European traditions.
Well, I think Jack was quite smitten with English traditions. A lot of Morris dancing, folk singing, a lot of the folk songs, and the early Revels were a mixture. It's kind of Revels time, medieval Renaissance. So he'd mix in different things there, but with a lot of English content. Interestingly, the first kind of avant-garde Revels didn't get outside England, but moved to Victorian. And Victorian, and it's very controversial. I think that a lot of people were disturbed by the idea of it not being what they were used to.
It was too modern. Right?
It was too modern, right? Yeah. And David Jones he's a folk singer, knows all the old songs, but he's also he has this tradition of the music hall, and the music hall has a whole style, and it's tremendous sort of working class fun in England, and David really knows how to sell that on stage, and I think you'll see versions of it.
Hello, I'm David Jones. I used to be the music hall singer in the Victorian Revels a long time ago, and I'll just sing you a little snatch of a song I sang back in those days. I'm a broken-hearted milkman, in grief I'm arrayed, and it's all for the love of a young serving maid, who lived on board and wages, the house to keep clean, of a gentleman's family in Paddington Green. She was as beautiful as a butterfly, and as proud as a queen, was pretty little Polly Perkins of Paddington Green. I love being in the Revels, I did. I love the cast and all the wonderful people involved with the show. The audiences, they were terrific. They'd come along and they'd dance and sing. It was so wonderful. And happy 50th, Revels, and bye-bye.
I'm a broken-hearted milkman, in the grief I'm arrayed. all for the love of a young serving maid who lived on board and wages, the house to keep clean, of a gentleman's family in Bannington Green. She was beautiful as a butterfly and as proud as a queen, was pretty little Polly Perkins of Bannington Green.
David Jones, the old and the new, but the same song, George Jamrog.
The pretty Polly Perkins of Paddington Square. We love
Green.
hearing that. Paddington Green.
Thank you.
Where I don't know, I just made up the square business. It's so great to hear him doing that. When he sent us that postcard, I don't think he realized that we were also going to be showing the 1977 version. So it's a great juxtaposition, I'd say.
Absolutely Victorian, Paddy, in its elements, everything about it, its humor, its movement, the choreography is really music hall.
Yeah, and you know, as I said, I was brought up in Manchester, which, you know, was the first industrial city, and those people, there was no weekend at that point. People worked in the cotton mills. I mean, it was a big industrial magnet for the world at that point, and the workers then needed a place to relax. And so, you know, amongst other, they invented Blackpool, which was like the seaside town with the imitation Eiffel Tower and the zoo and the ballroom and the fun fair and the Three Piers. But at home, they had the music halls, and they were very popular. One of the places where women and men could mix, in, you know, early on, and a little disreputable, very fueled a lot by alcohol, but developing this wonderful style with an MC who would kind of mediate things and interestingly sat right between the audience and the stage and linked the two. I always think of Jack Langstaff in that context, that fourth wall was similarly dissolved, you know.
Very much so, and many of the elements of music hall, even when the themes were not necessarily Victorian England, were imported into Revels presentations. Really, that audience participation, the rituals as we went on already, what the crowd expectation was to happen at particular times. They're all music hall tropes, and as you pointed out, Jack Langstaff as the master of ceremonies, as the ringmaster, if you will. Very, very present throughout. And now David Coffin, of course, taking that role largely. David, do you look at people like David Jones as people who have gone before, passing on that tradition? How important is that?
Well, certainly when we're doing a Victorian show, it feels natural that David Jones be on stage, because I mean it's sort of a typecasting, if you will, but he's just a natural in that role.
He welcomes that, though, doesn't he?
Sure.
Oh, absolutely.
Loves playing that role.
We had a wonderful Maggie Pearce as well, who was also
from Belfast. Yeah.
From Belfast, yeah, that's right.
Maggie Pearce.
And she carries that whole tradition as well. Wonderful.
So we're going to move on from that, from David. We're going to move on to two pieces that we will be juxtaposing together. George, I'm going to ask you to introduce what we're about to see.
Yes, we're going to hear from Liesl Kuhlbach and Tom Pixton, as different as two people can be, actually, but they represent Revels history in very significant ways. Liesl, as you may remember, was actually the person who played Abbott's Bromley horn dance on the recorder before there was a David Coffin, and so that's her claim to fame. But she's done a lot else besides, and as a member of Voice of the Turtle, done many Sephardic songs on our stage, and we're going to hear one of them. And then quickly, Tom Pixton, who I consider a real polymath, harpsichord player, accordion player, completely well-versed in Balkan music and Scottish music and you name it. He can play it, and he's a deep knowledge guy and a wonderful performer. You don't often see him on stage because he's usually in the band with his accordion or harpsichord, as he was in our Scottish show for the first half in 2003. So we're going to see him in a clip where he's actually singing a Romanian song.
Hello, I'm Liesla Kuhlbach, and I've been in many Revels. And the first one was, I believe, the second year they put it on in Cambridge at Sanders Theatre. I was the only instrumentalist aside from the brass band, and I'd leave instruments around the theater so I could get to them when I needed them. They were hidden. So I'd play the Abbott's Bromley from the balcony, then make my way over to the back of the mezzanine where the children were waiting and play my three-hole pipe that I had left there, down the middle aisle, all the way to the stage, find my rebec so I could play Pig Went Out to Dig with them.
I'm Tom Pixton from Arlington, Massachusetts. I first became involved with Revels in 1985 when I was on the design team that produced the Christmas Revels songbook, working with Jack Langstaff and Rain Miller. It was some years later that I began a long collaboration with Revels as a musician, singer, and arranger on numerous Revels productions and recordings. Revels is a whole lot more than singing and putting on a show. It's become one of my most cherished extended families, becoming richer every year. Revels promotes a curiosity of other cultures, teamwork, intergenerational collaboration, and a commitment to making the world a more humane place. Join us in celebrating 50 years of Christmas Revels. And to quote Jack Langstaff, "Waken the earth with your singing."
Hai națiune și nu mă bate Și zilmună pe săltate Să se mire și pe sate Hai mă creierul de cuvânt Că spunai numai la joc Dar nu mi-e pasat de loc Hai cu te urlau cu strune La casa psihodine Hop și așa
Tom Pixton in full flight there, George, with his accordion. As you said, really an amazing musician.
Right. Finally, you get to see him on stage actually singing, and which we don't often get to do. And this is a wonderful Romanian love song. Oh, I shouldn't say love song. It's actually the translation is about there's a fire burning under my boots. So it's a little bit more about dancing than it is about passion for
It sounds like something
love.
from the music hall.
That's right, exactly. Exactly, except it's in Romanian, that language that he's singing there. Talk about that for a moment, Paddy, singing in vernacular, singing in languages of the pieces. How do these actors, many of them are just from the community, they learn these songs phonetically?
Well, yeah, I think all sorts of different ways. Megan Henderson, who was our music director for the last 4 years, was a taskmaster, taking the chorus through broken down versions of the pronunciation, of the inflection, of the consonants and the vowels, really some real boot camp work for choruses in order to be authentic when you actually get to sing it. And one of the great, we've had this occasionally coming back to us as, in reviews, that the people from the culture that you're representing say, oh, that sounded just like my language, and that's a huge achievement, I think, for us to aim for. That's.
And it's a lot of work. George, back to you again. Lisla, they are singing a piece in Ladino, the Jewish diaspora language associated mostly with Spain. Again, an example of the reach of Revels. You don't shy away from reaching deep into other cultures.
Yes, and we often rely on people like Lisla and the Voice of the Turtle members who are deeply enmeshed in the traditions that they're representing. We trust them to bring us the material and the style that we know is going to resonate with the people from that community. So this is a song called La Lleve de España, and it was composed by Flori Jagoda, who was born in Yugoslavia and escaped the Nazis when she was 16.
So a lot of history on there.
A lot of history, yeah.
Really amazing. David, I'm going to move to you to introduce the two next players in a double clip. Now, quite contrasting with each other music style-wise, everything about these two shows were very, very different.
Oh, you think so?
A little bit. And a wonderful way, again, in juxtaposing the levels and the directions, the corners that Revels will go into for inspiration.
Yeah, we go there. There's no place is safe from us for gathering material and traditions. The first person you hear from is your friend Maeve Gilchrist.
What a sweetheart in every way. She is just a wonderfully inspiring musician and composer and leader and everything.
Yes, she's and a terrific presence on stage as well. Playing a beautiful tune, She Begs, She More, which I'm sure you're familiar with as well. And then our longtime friend Stan Strickland, local saxophone player, improv on the sax, and just an amazing, gifted musician, playing a variety of styles in his own work, and also a beautiful dancer as well. So
and
to have him on stage, just his very presence on stage is just so uplifting and wonderful.
And it really is his very presence, as David says. Stan Strickland, of course, has been involved in other Revels performances as well, particularly Miss River Sing this year, which you've been doing variously at the Weeks Bridge right near Harvard Square.
Stan is like one of these threads that runs through Revels. It's interesting. Of course, he was found by Jack, and he has reappeared at different times. But interestingly, these two, Maeve and Stan, also represent an area that Revels has been pushing into, which is the Revels fringe. We've always, I've been sort of keen on this idea of people with their feet in tradition who are taking it to completely different areas. And we started this program called Revels Fringe, of putting people that we thought would be good together, chemically, that they would. And the first one was a remarkable concert with Carlos Nunez, the Galician piper, and George actually was backstage with him, convincing him that Revels was a good thing to do. And then Maeve and who's the fiddler? Hanneke? No.
Hanneke Castle.
Hanneke Castle. And Stan. And lots of wonderful things happened. We had also sword dancers, rapper sword dancers in that. But a lot of wonderful things happened, but the really splendid moment was when we had this fusion of the bagpipes and the soprano saxophone, starting at different times with a Galician tune, coming together and fusing, just riffing on stage in the most remarkable way. At the end of it, Carlos sat down and it's like, and said, soprano saxophone and bagpipe, never before,
Just extraordinary moments putting people together like that. We're about to see Maeve Gilchrist on the harp and then Stan Strickland.
Happy 50th birthday to the Christmas Revels in Cambridge. It's my great delight to know you as a harp player in your Christmas productions and in your Revels Fringe series, and as an audience member who's sat many years now for your Christmas production and just basked in the warm glow that your community and your productions create. Revels is an organisation that doesn't just bring high quality entertainment to the theatre, but which supports all of the arts in Boston throughout the year. It's an organisation that brings together people, regardless of background, to sing together. In a time that's so completely divided, this seems even more important than ever, to bring people together, to create music and create something beautiful. So thank you, Revels, for bringing such heart with your voices and yourselves to the Boston area. I only wish we could be together this year. But happy birthday, eat cake, we'll be singing from our houses. Happy birthday.
Hi, I'm Stan Strickland. Being a part of the Revels family and community has been one of the greatest joys of my musical life. From all those wonderful performances at Sanders Theater to traveling to so many great cities across the country and performing with Jack Langstaff and so many great musicians and guest artists. What a joy to learn and play music from around the world, from so many different cultures, and to be a part of such a grand tradition. Revels has been an amazing addition to my life, and I will always be grateful. So let's keep it going.
Stan Strickland and before Stan, Maeve Gilchrist. But staying with Stan for a moment, George, playing the flute there. He's a man of many talents.
He is. And I wish we had some nice video footage of him from our shows playing the flute, but in fact, it's mostly saxophone that we have of him. And I was just remembering a minute ago that we have a terrific example of him dancing in 1986 American show to the Babe of Bethlehem, choreographed by Carol Langstaff. But the videography was not of a point where we could actually capture that. So I would love to see him dancing. I'd love to see him playing the flute. And I'd love to hear him singing again, because he's got a gorgeous voice and he's a terrific stylist.
David, for the length of time you've been with Revels, you've seen a lot of changes technologically. It must be wonderful now to think that all of these performances, like the beautiful shots of Maeve Gilchrist we just saw playing the harp, that they're there for posterity, as opposed to the grainy black and whites we had earlier, or even no video at all from the very earliest of days.
Well, you got to love the grainy black and whites. I mean, it gives us that sense of time. But yes, the technology improvements are quite noticeable. And certainly the quality of sound through the ages, and just the different miking on the stage. I mean, we've added overhead mics above the stage to the floor mics, body mics for soloists and so forth. So you can really get into the depth of the stage and the sound, which is wonderful to be able to capture that.
And capture it for posterity as well.
And the audience.
And the audience
singing. Because that's such a huge part of all of this.
Well, on this album, as well, as George referenced earlier, we've got 50 years of recordings on here. So you can hear those changes. And you talked about this earlier very clearly. And there's a kind of a beauty to it. It's almost like a sonic trip down the years, because you can hear, first of all, just essentially, in the early days, you would have performed with no miking at all on a Sanders stage, all the ways to a much closer series of mics, especially for solo performers. And Paddy, I had talked about David being the voice of Revels really on stage, but there is another voice that has been around for a long period of time from the community, but has become such an intrinsic part of Revels, and we're about to see her, Jamie Jaffe.
Oh, Jamie, yeah, she's a force of nature. She came, through the chorus and has been a chorus member over many years, but emerged as just an extraordinary voice, and has performed in many different guises through shows. She was in the Roma show. I think she was featured, and I remember her singing, the Welsh show, right, where she sang this very ancient, rather disturbing song. I mean, it's really dark, and it was about the birth of Taliesin. And we had, I actually had to cover some ground with people moving across the front of the stage to the other side. And this was really it was like covering that, but became like a very intense and wonderful moment. Yeah.
She is just quite extraordinary, as I said, and she's also a kind of a leader amongst those choruses. I know from experiencing this firsthand one year when I did Revels, the Spring Revels, as it was known back then, that Jamie took many of us by the hand and really led us into the culture and the tradition that was Revels, and I'll never forget her for that, and love always seeing her on stage. Jamie Jaffe.
I performed in my first Christmas show in 1986, and since then Revels has blessed me with many singing opportunities, so I was thrilled to learn that I'm featured on a track of the 50th anniversary CD. But for me, it's the deeply meaningful process of creating a community of singers that keeps me coming back. In a Christmas Revels chorus, individuals form families, and families coalesce into a village of people whose language may vary with each Christmas show, but who share one common goal: to create a joyful celebration of seasonal traditions, to bid farewell to the old year, and to embrace the new year. But Christmas Revels is not just a show, it's an invitation. Because when singers take to the stage of Sanders Theatre, we invite every audience member to join our village, to celebrate with us, to sing and dance with us. And suddenly, our community is multiplied exponentially. And what began as an individual experience is now a collective experience that welcomes everyone. And that is the magic of Revels.
Chers reveleurs et chères reveleuses, it's a great pleasure for me to participate in your 50th anniversary and at the same time to say thank you to everybody for this memorable experience I had by participating dans le spectacle de la Chasserie in so many years in so different cities. I hope that the Revels will continue their wonderful work for another half century, always in this spirit of openness, sharing and friendship. Je vous souhaite à tout le monde un très bel anniversaire, un beau 50e et au plaisir de se revoir. Bye!
Jamie Jaffe there, and as if to contrast, we threw in an extraordinary dancer from Canada, dancing in that very distinct Quebecois style. George, that was Pierre Chartrand, right? And somebody in costume as well dancing. That's not easy to do.
That was Judy Erickson, and she was playing the role of the devil. And he was chasing her off of stage because he has won the dance-off contest between the two of them. It was a wager that they had made and early on in the show. This was his triumphant moment, out dancing her.
He was absolutely amazing. He's like a spinning top because he's low to the ground, but he just floats on top of the air, Paddy. A lot of traditions on that particular Revels from Quebec.
Yeah, that's a rich source of traditional material. Very wonderful kitchen music. You know, somebody explained that to me of, you know, how do you get percussion into the kitchen, and they do it just sitting and using their feet, so to have that sound. And out of that grew this sort of Quebecois step dancing tradition. And he's a remarkable proponent of it. He taught a dance called Brandy, right, which is it's mind-boggling, foot-boggling, you know, to a chorus. It's sort of a quadrille dance, but done whilst doing this Quebecois clog step. So it was a feat.
Pierre certainly was an extraordinary guest and a memorable one. David Coffin, in your time with Revels, it seems to me that the team spirit is extraordinarily important. This is a group that comes together. There are certain consistent elements to it, like we talked about Jamie and yourself, and of course George and Paddy in the background and the artistic side of it. But the kind of unpredictable nature of a team coming together and what the spirit ends up on stage as it must be have your heart in your mouth every year.
Oh, absolutely, and it's a different team every year as well. So it's that sense of community on stage translating to the audience. It feels like you're just building one big community, from the one we have on stage to the one out in the audience.
It's really extraordinary. A different team and a different theme. The Irish have a difficulty with the TH, so we often go like, team. What's the team this year? We're going to continue and go back to Canada, a theme, Paddy, that has been covered before in Christmas Revels and in Spring Revels. That whole theme of Le Grand Dérangement, the whole changes in Canada that went on, and the migrations of French culture down through England, perhaps into Louisiana.
Yeah, and you know, in the context of this enormous displacement of refugees, it seemed to be a show that we should do. And the story, you know, pinning it to this story of the Acadians, who were a very tight community up there on the borders there in Acadia, border of the US and Canada. Being on the border at the time was a problem because they were constantly shunted as the war was going on between the British and the French. They were constantly on the wrong side of it, and eventually the British threw them out. And they began what was an enormous, if you look on the map, they went everywhere. It was like an explosion of people across to Brittany, across, you know, down to the Caribbean, all over the place. Sometimes back and forth, and eventually ending up in Louisiana, and forming this group, which became, you know, what they called Cajuns. Acadians became Cajuns, and developing this new hybrid music. That was so rhythmic and beautiful.
Fascinating hybrid music, as you said. And George, you accessed somebody who's very well known to the folk community all over New England, and he himself comes from an amazing background and is a fluent French speaker for this role.
Keith Murphy, you're talking about. Yes, Keith is an extraordinary Renaissance man too. He has the pedigree from Newfoundland. Am I right? Or Labrador?
Yeah,
Newfoundland
right.
is his background.
St. John's.
So he comes by it honestly. And he's a master on guitar and other stringed instruments, mandolin, and a wonderful pianist, a great keyboard player, and he understands the dance. He understands traditional dance, so he accompanies dance just extraordinarily beautifully. And then, as you see in the video coming up, a beautiful singer too, because he captures the mood of this dérangement, where the Acadians have to flee their homes, and you get the sense of their homes burning.
Sadness.
And he is telling the story of coming back to Canada and finding nothing left. The town has been destroyed, and it's a very heart-rending song. And it's in contrast to the one coming up, which maybe I'm jumping the gun, but Sophie Michaud sings us a different song of a completely different style, and I juxtapose these two songs because they're both wonderful singers in their own right, but very different.
David, we're nearing the end of this. We're going to hear from Keith and Sophie here, but the early music of Revels seems to fit in with you. You come from a very, very broad background, lots of different instruments in your quiver, if you will. But the original value of Revels, really, that medieval masque music, is a core value that is still not forgotten in spite of all of the musical adventures that Revels has taken over the years.
Definitely not forgotten. We think of it as part of our roots. And we will go back to our roots periodically as the themes develop over the years. We have to go back and touch base. You know, it's like with the Victorian. We have to do the Victorian every now and then. But people think of the Victorian and the medieval Revels as, you know, the original. So we will never lose that, for sure.
As a matter of fact, we were planning on doing that this year.
Yeah.
This 50th year, you know, going back to the roots and connecting it to the future. But now, of course, we are doing an entirely different thing. We'll talk about that.
We certainly will. I'm looking forward to that as well. But first, we've got Keith Murphy and then Sophie Michaud.
Hi, my name's Keith Murphy. I was part of the 2016 Acadian Cajun Christmas Revels show. And I have to say, Christmas has never quite been the same without getting to put on that 18th century French peasant costume. But it was a wonderful experience, such an incredible group of musicians to get to play with, and such a pleasure to work with that cast and crew. The show was so artfully done, such a beautiful weaving together of that great music with a very powerful historical narrative. And it was just such a joyful, beautiful, beautiful thing. So a great, memorable experience for me, as I know it has been for so many thousands of people over the years, both on stage and in the audience. And so for that, I say to you, Revels, bon anniversaire, happy birthday, well done, and thank you.
Dans mon chemin, j'ai rencontré un homme que j'avais oublié. Il m'a dit que le surprise. Où t'en vas-tu dans les États? Tu vas rencontrer la misère. Dans les États, non, y vas-y donc pas. Je suis resté le cœur saisi, je suis resté le cœur meurtri. Et c'est là que j'ai dit à ma femme, ainsi que mes petits-enfants, nous allons poursuivre nos routes. Dieu nous préservera d'accidents.
Hello, my name is Sophie Michaud, and I was thrilled to be part of the 2017 Christmas Revels show. That experience for me was a little bit like when you travel to a place that you don't know and you're invited to dinner. And you don't know what to expect, but then you open the door and all of a sudden you see a lot of people with different ages and different backgrounds, and everyone is happy and excited and caring and integrates you and invites you to sit at the table, and all of a sudden you're sharing delicious food and wine. Everything is colorful, and someone bursts into song, and someone just starts dancing, and someone shares poetry, and everyone is here and has been here for a long time and will be here for a long time. And you know that you're part of something that's way bigger than this particular night. Everyone is here for something bigger than themselves, and you can really sense that at Revels. It's such a wonderful experience, and I'm so excited for the next 50 years to come. Happy 50th, Revels.
What an amazing contrasting pair there. We had Keith Murphy with a song in French from Quebec and Sophie Michaud with a piece of early music, very contrasting, and yet in their very contrast, very typical Revels, George.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Yeah, you have the French folk song Le Départ du Canada, and then you have Sophie doing this Monteverdi showpiece. It's just a wild, extraordinary, virtuosic piece, and there couldn't be anything more classical than that, just as there couldn't be anything more folky than what Keith did. And it just goes to show that Revels has a way of throwing these things together on the same stage. Sophie is singing from the Venetian Christmas Revels, and Keith from the Acadian Cajun Christmas Revels the year before. But what a contrast. We often do that. We find resonance between a folk song and an art song, which strangely sometimes often works very well together.
Paddy, back to Jack Langstaff for just a second. 1957, he went on stage with his daughter Carol to create that first iteration that essentially became Revels. What would Jack think right now if he saw last year's Revels, for example, or the last few years, would he think this is a natural progression, or was there a jump along the way?
Yeah. Oh, I think there was a jump, but the sort of jump that in my opinion, Jack would say, "Oh, that's interesting. That's a, you know." He was rarely, you know, the anchor of his professional career, or all of the things that he had done before, you know, which were enormously solid, and never precluded him from thinking outside the box and bringing people in that, you know, he knew were going to take it sort of outside. There was a famous show that we did, that he did before I was here, called The Dark and the Light. And he had
Chris
Janney, famous for making those musical stairs that you find in the Museum of Science, an art installation that he took all over the world, you know. And he also did a thing with recording Mikhail Baryshnikov's heartbeat that Baryshnikov then danced to. So, you know, an artist who was very much outside of the context of Revels, and he said, "We're going to do a show with him." And, you know, and I think there was a laser projector
in the hall at intermission. There was a laser projecting across the hallway, and if you put your hand up,
right,
it created a sound.
That's right.
And it would just be completely random. Yeah,
that's
welcome
right.
you.
And the Mummers play that year was done in mime. No words at all. And there was a trap set drummer, right? What was his name?
David Moss.
David Moss. So all of these elements were, you know, and the audience were, as we know, Jack said, this audience will go wherever I ask them to. And they did.
They did.
I mean, I think there was a lot of feedback about, you know, this isn't quite what we had in mind.
Revels audiences are not shy.
But, no, that's right. But they were 100%, you know, into going there. So yeah, I think he would approve. I think he would be on board with you know, the changes that inevitably are going to come with a 50-year-old organization. You know, you can't be set in amber, as you said. It's you really have to keep your ear. And Jack would always know what the best movie was that was out at the time, the best concert to go to. You know, he was all over the place with ears open and eyes open, and ready to take that on as part of the you know, the fabric of.
And he'd be the last person to want to see Revels become codified into certain formulaic traditions.
Yeah,
which is a great thing. That's certainly my knowledge and my memory of him.
I think if Jack saw a recent show, his eyes would be wide open, but his grin would be ear to ear.
Absolutely. That's a very good way to put it, because you can imagine him doing that. But also, as you point out, Paddy, the visionary is often best served by kind of stepping to the side and watching the creation develop and grow up, essentially, and leave the nest.
That's extremely rare, I should say. You know, the dance of succession that went on. You know, people always talk about, you know, founders syndrome, and no way that ever was an issue with Jack. It was like, there you go.
There it is.
And David, you've experienced that too, right?
Yeah.
Well, I'm speaking with a group here, a trio that has taken that to the next level and will continue to take it to the next level. We are celebrating the release of the Christmas Revels, celebrating 50 years this year, a pivotal year and one that we will remember. It has so many pieces on here, including ending with the aforementioned Sussex Mummers Carol, but that is track number 32 on the second CD. So we're talking about 64 tracks on this album. Memories, all of them, of Revels. Paddy, back to you on this and talk about what you've got planned. But there's a kind of an obligation, really, on the part of Revels to bring some light into people's homes this year, given particularly that we can't gather because of COVID.
Right. Yeah, that's... that's maybe the difference between anything which has ritual at its core, that there's an obligation. As you say, it's a work. It's rather than an entertainment, it's something that we are doing. We're actually making something happen. And that thing at this time of the year is bringing the light back out of the dark. The old year dies off on the shortest day of the year. It's the darkest time of the year. And in that little inflection point is where we are, and our job is to bring back the light. And we're kind of involving our community in that. At this time, in a very much larger metaphorical sense, we're in a very dark place. And people, the world is coming apart. And we've created this program called Revels Connects, because I think that's what we do. And all sorts of different ways of doing that. For Christmas Revels, it's a very specific problem because, as we said, we are the polar opposite of social distancing. So to find a way to actually engage people, we have to do a kind of stage magic. Everybody knows that the woman that is being sawn in half is not really being sawn in half, but you have to convince people that they suspend their disbelief for a moment. It's the essence of theater. And you say, okay, this is happening. So we've got to do that with a two-dimensional screen. And the one thing that we came up with is this idea. We were looking like how to present the 50 years of Revels in a show. And we realized that there are two people who have seen every single performance of every single Revels show. And they are two characters called James Otis and Josiah Quincy. And they're not on our mailing list, but they stand on either side of the Revels stage. They are the two marble statues. And so we have to animate those two statues because they have heard every single note of every Revels. So we bring them to life, and then we can access these echoes, through the ages, and then we get into our Pandora's box of archives, because we have some great video archives that we've been looking at. George and I have been spending hours and hours looking through these archives, and that will be the essence of the show. We're also going to have the makers of the show on stage. Again, with magic, green screens and things like that. But we will be there, like 6 characters in search of a play, saying, how do we make this Christmas Revels? And the statues will tell us how to do that.
So, George, you will be there for the audience this year. It will be virtual because it has to be. It's certainly less desirable than us all gathering for 18, 19 shows at beautiful Sanders Theatre. But it sounds like it's going to be a special presentation and made better by the assembling of the audience that would normally come to Cambridge.
Mm-hmm. I think that it's going to be an extraordinary show because not only do we have digging into our archives, as Patty described, which is really very similar to the experience that I had in putting the CD together, because with the CD I really went deep and found treasures that sounded good. Now I'm doing the whole process all over again, going way back and pulling out the pieces that not only sound but also look good. And in some cases, they're the same. Some of the pieces on the CD will show up in the Christmas show, but for the most part, it's new material that you won't hear on the CD. There's all that, which is the archival bit, and then there's the live bit, which is we have an audience. We have an audience of a couple of hundred singing heads in an empty Sanders Theatre. And as we sing Joy to the World and other things, Dono Nobis Pacem, for instance, you will see these people singing away because they all sent in videos of themselves singing to the same guide track. And so hundreds of people out there who've just decided they wanted to be in the audience this year.
This is going to be amazing. Hats off to you guys for doing it, and congratulations on all of your work over the years. And looking forward, of course, so much to being back together again at Sanders Theatre and the many other events that Revels is involved in. Celebrating community, celebrating the history of song, the importance of ritual, and the development of civilization, essentially. And that's not too lofty, I think, to say, because it is such an important backdrop to our lives. Again, the Christmas Revels celebrating 50 years, and certainly something that is treasured here in the area and in 8 cities around the
9
country.
including us.
9 including Cambridge Revels. And remember, in buying that CD, by the way, and in supporting the online presentation, the virtual concert, you're also supporting the work of Revels. Like many not-for-profits all around us, they are hurting at this time, and Revels does actually derive a lot of its income from the Christmas Revels that happens each and every year. So again, your support makes a difference to the ongoing health of an organisation like Revels that we treasure here in New England. Great to join with you guys this morning here at St. John's in Watertown. Of course, Revels office is upstairs in this hall with the doors open and the air chilly and us socially distanced. It still has the warmth of all of those rehearsals and all of those gatherings that have happened here in the past and indeed will again. Can we end with just a few lines of the shortest day, and we'll all go Welcome Yule at the end of it, David? Are you ready for that?
And so do we, here, now, this year, and every year. Welcome Yule!
Welcome Yule!